Girlhood spent in her uncle's bed until she ran. A Lakota chief was the first man she chose. The horse came in alone. That was the first thing. No rider, no gear except a broken lead rope dragging in the frozen mud. A gray mare, good bone, trembling at the chest. She walked straight to the trough like she'd been here before, though I'd never seen her. I stood at the edge of the corral and watched her drink and thought nothing of it at first. Horses get loose. Horses wander. In late October on the northern plains, when the wind comes off the buttes in long, cold sheets, a horse without shelter will find its own way to warmth. I sent my nephew Chask to follow her tracks back through the sage. He came back an hour later with the girl. She was on foot and she hadn't been walking long, her boots weren't that worn through, but she was cold enough that her hands weren't working right. She held them against her sides like tools she'd forgotten how to use. Chask had given her his blanket, and she had it pulled up to her jaw, walking ahead of him the way a person walks when they don't know if they should be grateful or afraid and haven't decided yet. I was standing at the door of the lodge when they came in off the flat. She stopped about 20 feet out and looked at me. I want to tell you what that looked like, not because it's the important part, not yet, but because it's where everything starts, and I've been carrying it a long time. 19 years this past autumn. She stopped and looked at me, and she was thin, white woman, maybe 20 years old, dark hair loose and half frozen at the ends. Her face had a bruise on it that was already going yellow, several days old. She wasn't crying. She wasn't asking for anything. She just stood there with her hands at her sides and looked at me the way a person looks when they've made a decision and they're waiting to find out if it was a fatal one. I said, "Come inside." "That's all, just come inside." She did. My name is Mapia Hanska, Long Cloud. Some of the traders called me Thomas, which I never understood. I never offered them that name, and they never asked for mine. The white soldiers at the agency called me Chief Long Cloud, which was accurate enough in their terms. I was 43 years old that October. I had been leading what remained of my band for 11 years, since my uncle Takan died of the spotted sickness, and left me with 87 people and a winter coming and a government agent already waiting at the edge of our camp with papers he wanted signed. I did not sign them that winter. I did not sign them the next winter either. By the time this girl walked out of the sage with my nephew's blanket around her shoulders, I had been fighting those papers for 9 years and I was losing. Not in the way a man loses a fight, not all at once, not with any clear moment of defeat. Just the slow, daily losing that comes when the thing you're fighting has more time than you do and doesn't need to win, only to outlast. The reservation boundaries kept moving. The buffalo were mostly gone. 2 of my best men had taken their families south to the agency the previous spring, and I didn't blame them. I understood why. I just couldn't do it myself, not yet, maybe not ever. I had children buried on this land. My wife Wombly Win, Eagle Woman, was in the ground up on the North Ridge where the 2 pines grow close together, had been for 4 years. Our son went with her. The fever took them both in the same week, and I wasn't there. I was south at the agency, arguing about the boundary markers with a man who had the manners of a post and the intelligence of one too. So that was the life I was living when the gray mare came in alone. 87 people and then 71 and then, by that October, 54. 3 lodges, a hard winter coming, and me, 43 years old with my wife 4 years in the ground and my hands full of everything except the thing I was made for. My people needed me to be something I wasn't sure I still was. She slept most of the first 2 days. My sister Thankan, we called her Than, just the short of it, she was the one who looked after the girl, fed her broth, checked the bruise on her face and the older marks on her wrists that told a longer story than the bruise did. I didn't ask about those. Not yet, not my place. A woman who shows up with marks like that doesn't need the man who gave her shelter to start asking questions before she's ready to answer them. She woke up on the 3rd morning and came out of the lodge in the gray light before anyone else was moving, and she stood there looking at the plain to the east like she was waiting for something to come out of it. I was already up. I sleep badly in late autumn. Always have. Something about the particular cold of it. The way it gets into the old arrow scar on my left side. A souvenir from a dispute 15 years back that I won but didn't come out of clean. I was sitting outside the fire lodge with a cup of water gone cold, and I watched her stand there for a while. After a bit I said, "Nobody's coming." She turned around. I said, "Whatever you left, it's not tracking you here. If it were, it would have come the first night." She looked at me a long time, then she said, "You don't know that." I said, "You're right, but I know what a woman looks like when she's listening for hoofbeats, and I know you haven't heard any yet, or you wouldn't have slept as long as you did." She thought about that, then she said, "My name is Nora." I said, "I know. My nephew told me. He talks more than a man should before sunrise." And she almost smiled. Not quite, but the corner of her mouth moved. It was enough. I told her my name. She tried it once, quietly, the way you test a word in a language you don't know, and she nodded like she was filing it somewhere she meant to keep it. I said, "Go back inside, it's cold." She said, "I've been inside for 2 days." I said, "1 more hour won't kill you, but the cold might." She looked at me for a beat, then she went in. No argument, but no hurry about it either. She took her time, and I noticed that the way she moved like a person who was deciding to comply, not obeying. There's a difference. I've met enough people on both sides of it to know. Her last name was Cade, Nora Cade. She told me that a week later when she'd been fed enough to have opinions again. She said it like she was testing how it sounded, not with pride, not with shame, just careful, the way you say a word out loud to see if it still fits. I didn't ask her story. I want to be clear about that. I had enough to do without absorbing someone else's trouble, and besides, the marks on her wrists told me the shape of it well enough. A woman doesn't get marks like that from a stumble. A woman doesn't get a bruise that old on a face that young from a horse. She told me anyway in pieces over the following weeks. Not because I asked, because she was the kind of person who couldn't carry a thing quietly. She had to say it out loud to make it real, to put it somewhere outside herself. I understood that. I'm the same way, though I do it differently. She used words. I use the land. I'll go up on the ridge and stand in the wind and let it take what I'm carrying for a while. Different tools, same need. Her uncle's name was Roy Cade. He'd raised her since she was 9, after her parents died of a fever on the Missouri. She said it flat, like she was reading from a ledger. Her parents had a farm. The farm went to Roy after they died because there was no one else. She went with the farm. She said she didn't know for a long time that what Roy did to her wasn't something that happened to everyone. She'd grown up in a house where it did, and there was nobody outside that house she trusted enough to ask. She said that was the worst part looking back. Not what he did, though that was the worst part too, she said, catching herself. Both things were true at once, but that she'd spent years thinking it was ordinary. That girls everywhere were the same kind of afraid she was. I didn't say anything when she told me this. I just listened. She said she ran the previous spring, after Roy brought home a man named Delwood who looked at her the way Roy did, and she understood what was being arranged. She'd taken the gray mare, her mare, she said, the only thing in that house that had ever been hers, and she'd ridden north because north was away, and then she kept riding because she didn't know where else to go, and then the mare's shoe had come loose and she'd had to slow down, and by the time she got up near our territory, she was 4 days out with nothing left to eat and the first real cold coming in. She said, "I wasn't planning on finding anyone. I was just trying to get away from someone." I said, "Those are not always so different." She looked at me when I said that. Not like it surprised her, but like it confirmed something she'd already been thinking. I went back to the horse I was working on, the lead rope I was rebraiding. She sat near the fire for a while without saying anything more, and after a time she picked up a piece of mending Than had left on the log beside her and started in on it without being asked. That told me something too. I should say something about what my people thought of her being there. They were not, to put it plain, glad about it. Not angry, that's not the right word. But a white woman in our camp was a complication, and everyone knew it. Any passing soldier or agency rider who spotted her could make trouble for us in ways I didn't need. There were already men at the agency who wanted reasons to move against us. I didn't want to hand them one. Than came to me in the second week and said, in the direct way she has, "What are you going to do with her?" I said, "She's healing. I'll figure it out when she's healed." Than said, "She looks at you." I said, "People look at things." Than said something I won't repeat, but the tone of it was affectionate, so I let it go. The truth is I hadn't let myself think about the looking. I'd noticed it, the way you notice whether it's there, it's real, you file it and go on with your work. I had work. I had more work than I had hours that winter. The buffalo hunt that fall had been thin. We needed to trade for enough to get through to spring, which meant going to the agency, which meant dealing with Harker, the agent, who was not a bad man exactly but was the kind of man who had a fixed idea of what was good for you and wasn't much interested in alternatives. I had 3 families whose lodges needed repair before the deep cold hit. I had a dispute between 2 of my men about a horse that had been going on since August and was starting to fester. Old Crowfeather claiming the black gelding was born from his mare. Young Lame Elk saying he'd trained it from a yearling, and that made it his, both of them right in their own way and neither willing to say so. I had Chask, my nephew, who was 22 years old and angry in the particular way young men get angry when they can see that the world they were promised isn't coming, and I needed to keep that anger pointed somewhere useful before it got pointed somewhere it would get him killed. I had enough. And then there was this woman, sitting by my fire in the evenings, learning 12 words of Lakota a day with the focused attention of someone who has decided that learning things is how she survives. She was quick, I'll say that. She picked up language the way some people do, not straining for it, just listening until it settled. Within a month she could follow most of a conversation. Within 2 she could hold one. Than, who had been wary of her at the start, started asking her to help with the work, the hides, the cooking, the mending, and Nora did it without complaint and without making it feel like charity on her part, which is rarer than you'd think. Some people help as a way of being admired for helping. She just helped. She'd come and look at what needed doing and start in on it. And if she didn't know how to do something right, she'd watch until she did and then keep at it until it was done. That kind of quiet industry earns a person more respect in 3 weeks than a month of good intentions. There was a morning in December. I'm going to tell this part carefully because it's the part that changed things, though not in the way you might think. I was out before light, checking the horses. We'd had a hard freeze the night before, cold enough to make the ground ring under your boots, cold that got in through your collar no matter how you had it wrapped, and I wanted to make sure the water hadn't gone over. I was at the trough, breaking the ice with the back of a hatchet, when I heard someone come up behind me. I turned and it was Nora, in her coat and Than's extra blanket pulled over her shoulders, her breath smoking in the gray air. She said, "Let me." I handed her the hatchet without thinking about it, and she broke the rest of the ice with clean, efficient strokes, not hard strokes, not showy, just the right amount of force in the right place, the way a person does it when it's a thing they've done 1,000 times before, which she probably had. She'd grown up on a farm. We stood there in the cold for a minute, not talking. The horses came up and drank, shoving at each other to get to the water, their big warm sides steaming in the dark. One of them, the old bay gelding I'd had for 7 years, pushed his nose against my arm and left a wet mark on my coat. Then she said, without looking at me, "I need to ask you something." I said, "Ask." She said, "Why haven't you sent me away?" I thought about that. There were several true answers. I said the most direct one, because there's nowhere to send you. She said, "Harker at the agency would send word to." I said, "To who?" "Your uncle." She went quiet. I said, even if I wanted to do that, and I don't, the agency would take 3 weeks to find anyone who'd claim you, and by then your uncle's man would be halfway up from wherever he started. You'd be in a room with Harker, and Harker means well, but he doesn't know what he's looking at. He'd hand you to the first white man who showed up with a story. She said, so I'm safer here. I said, for now, yes. She said, and when spring comes? I said, when spring comes, you'll have had a whole winter to figure out what you want to do next. A woman who speaks Lakota and can break ice and help with a hide can find a place somewhere on this plains if she decides she wants one. There are agency towns to the north, a few honest ones. There's translation work. There are women in the settlements who would take in another woman, no questions, if she came with useful hands. She turned and looked at me then, straight on, not sideways. She said, and here, is there a place here? I held her look. I said, that's a different question. She said, I know. Neither of us said anything else for a while. The horses moved around us in the dark, the steam off their backs rising slow in the cold air. One of the younger mares nudged Nora's shoulder with her nose, and Nora reached up without thinking and set her hand on the mare's neck, and the mare stood still for it. After a bit I said, go in, I'll finish here. She handed me back the hatchet. Her fingers were cold, I could see that, but she hadn't hurried. She went back toward the lodge, and I stood there in the freeze with the horses pushing at my arm looking for more water, thinking about the particular weight of a question that doesn't need answering yet but has been asked out loud, which is its own kind of answering. Winter on the northern plains does something to time. It slows it and compresses it at once. The days are short and the nights are long, and you spend most of both doing the close, repetitive work of staying alive, which puts you in a particular frame of mind. You stop thinking about next month. You think about tonight and tomorrow morning, and whether there's enough wood stacked under the windward side of the fire lodge, and whether the old ones are warm enough, and whether the horses have got enough to eat. It sounds like a hard way to live. It is. It's also the clearest I've ever been. I've known men who feared that kind of clarity. Men who'd rather keep moving, keep busy, keep the noise up, because silence lets you hear things you've been outrunning. I'm not that kind of man. I've never been. The silence has always been where I think best. Maybe that's why I didn't push the question she'd asked away. I let it sit, the way you let ice set, and I thought about it in the long dark hours when the fire was banked, and the camp was quiet, and the wind moved around the outside of the lodge like something looking for a way in. What I thought was this: Wanblee Wynn had been dead for 4 years. The grief for her was still real, not the sharp grief, not anymore, but the settled kind, the kind that's become part of the foundation of you, the kind you build the rest of yourself on top of. She was the best woman I'd known. She'd chosen me when she was 18 and I was 27 and already complicated, already carrying the weight of what was coming for my people, the long, slow thing that was happening all around us that I could see clearly even if I couldn't stop it. And she'd chosen me knowing that weight was part of the deal. She'd carried it alongside me without being crushed by it, without resenting it, and she'd also known when to put her hand on my arm in the night and say, "You're doing what can be done. That's enough." Her death had left a specific absence, not just her, but what I was when she was there. Something I'd been for her. The man who was steady and capable and worth choosing. That man had gotten harder to find in 4 years alone. I wasn't mooning about it. I want to be clear on that. I'm not the kind of man who moons, but I'd noticed its absence. The way you notice a familiar tool that's no longer on the peg where it belongs. You reach for it in the dark and your hand closes on nothing, and you go on with what you were doing, but you notice. You keep noticing. Nora Cade was not Wanblee Wynn. She wasn't trying to be. She was a woman I'd known for 2 months who'd come out of the sage with frost in her hair and a bruise on her face and nothing in her hands. And she was learning Lakota at a pace that impressed even Than, who was not easy to impress. And she was sitting at my fire in the evenings and asking me questions about everything. The land, the animals, the stories, the ceremony of things, the words for things that didn't have good translations, the way weather worked up here, why the buttes were shaped the way they were. She asked the way a person asks when they're genuinely trying to understand, not making conversation, not filling silence. She listened to the answer. She came back to it the next night with a follow-up. I hadn't been asked questions like that in a long time. I thought about that in the dark that December, while the wind came off the buttes. January was hard. We lost one of the old men, Shungmanidu Thanka, Gray Wolf, who had been my Uncle Takan's closest advisor and who had been old since before I could remember. Old in the way of men who seemed to have been born already carrying all the knowledge they'd ever have, who never seemed young. He died in his sleep, which was the best way. But his wife had died 3 years before and he had no children living, and it fell to me to do the right things for him, the right ceremonies, the right songs, the right silence afterward. And to sit with what he'd been, what he'd known that I'd never think to ask him, stories and cures and the names of places that only existed in the old language now, all of it going into the ground with a man who'd carried it for 80 years. He had known my grandfather. He'd sat at fires I'd never see. I sat with that for a few days. Not the grief exactly, well, the grief too, but under it the particular weight of what's lost when an old person dies with their knowledge still inside them. A whole country going quiet. Nora let me sit with it. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't try to fix it. She didn't offer comfort of the kind that makes a person feel watched rather than helped. She just gave me room, brought me food when I forgot to eat and set it down near me and went away. Sat near the fire in the evenings working on the mending or the hides without talking, available if I wanted company, absent if I didn't. She read me the way Than read me, the way a person reads you when they've been watching and listening long enough to know the difference between the kinds of quiet. On the 4th evening I told her about Gray Wolf. Not the grief exactly, but the man, the things he'd known, the way he held knowledge like it was a physical thing he was responsible for passing on, the particular sound of his voice when he was telling a story that had weight to it, the way he'd look at you when he was deciding whether you were ready for what he was about to say. She listened the whole way through without interrupting. Then she asked one question, just one. Did he know he was going to die that night? I said I think he did. He gave me something the day before. She said, what did he give you? I said, a knife, my grandfather's. He'd been keeping it for 30 years, waiting for the right time to give it back. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, then he knew. Men who know give things away first. I thought about that. I said, you know that how? She looked at the fire. She said, my father gave me his hat before he went to bed the night he died. I was 9. I didn't understand it then. He said, here, you keep this, and he handed it to me and went to bed, and he was dead before morning. I didn't understand it until I was older. We sat with that a while, both of us. Then she said, not looking at me, just watching the fire, I think you're a man who knows things, not just about the land, about people, about what they need and what they can do and what they can't. I've watched you with the people here, the way you see them. I said, I have been wrong before. She said, so has everyone who's ever been right about anything. I looked at her. She was looking at the fire, the side of her face in the light, that dark hair loose at her shoulders now, the bruise long gone, the wariness in her face replaced, not with ease exactly, but with something quieter. She had a calm about her that she hadn't had when she arrived. Not the calm of someone who'd given up, but the calm of someone who'd put something down and found they could still walk without it. I thought, she's going to be all right. Whatever she does next, she's going to be all right, this woman. And then I thought something else, which I kept to myself. February. The trouble with Harker came in February. He rode in with 2 soldiers and a civilian I didn't know, a lawyer type, in a coat that was wrong for the weather, the kind of coat that says the man inside it doesn't plan on being outside long and hasn't arranged to be. They came in mid-morning when the light was still flat and cold off the snow, and Harker was polite, as he always was, and got straight to the point, as he always did. He didn't waste my time. I'll give him that. He had new papers. The boundary was moving again. Not our winter ground, he was careful to say that, said it twice, but the summer hunting range to the west, the creek draws and the high grass country where we'd gone every year since before my grandfather was born, where the horses got fat and the children learned to ride in the long flat meadows and the old ones could sit out of the wind in the afternoons. They were opening it for settlement. He was sorry. He needed me to sign. I didn't sign. He said, Long Cloud, you need to think about your people. I said, that is all I do. He said, there are going to be settlers in that country come spring whether you sign or not. If you sign, at least there's a formal agreement, at least there's a record, at least your people are protected in the language of it. I said, a record of me giving away what was never mine to give. He looked at me for a long time. He was not a bad man. I keep saying that and I keep meaning it. He had a genuine belief that what he was doing was right and necessary and kind, which made him harder to argue with than a man who knew he was wrong and was doing it anyway. A man doing wrong on purpose can be shamed. A man doing wrong out of conviction is just going to do it again tomorrow with the same clean conscience. He said, I need you to consider the alternative. The alternative meant the agency. The agency meant the end of what we were, and the beginning of what they wanted us to be, which was a different kind of people, quieter and smaller and easier to manage. I said, I'll consider it, come back in the spring. He wasn't happy with that. He left the papers with me anyway, folded, on the log beside the fire, like a question I wasn't answering. He left. I stood outside a long time after his horse cleared the flat, until I couldn't hear the hoofbeats anymore and the wind had covered over that sound with its own. The papers were in my hand. I hadn't meant to pick them up. I just found them there. Nora came and stood near me, not touching, not talking, just close enough that I knew she was there. After a while she said, What are the papers for? I told her plain. She was quiet. She looked out at the flat the same direction I was looking. Then she said, What will you do? I said, I don't know yet. I know what I can't do. She said, There's a difference between can't and won't. I said, Yes, both of them true here. She said, I know. I'm not correcting you. I know what it is to have something taken from you that you can't get back, and I know what it is to hold the line anyway even when you're holding it alone, and even when holding it costs you more than it costs them. I see what you're carrying. I want you to know that I see it. I looked at her. She met my eyes straight on, no flinching, no looking away. She said, I think you're the most. She stopped. Something in her face shifted, like she'd started down one road and decided partway that it wasn't the right one. She started again. She said, I have been around men my whole life who took things, who thought taking was strength, who mistook the ability to force something for the right to do it. You're the first man I've known who's built something and defended it and not taken anything from anyone who didn't offer it first. I just wanted to say that. I should have said it a long time ago. I didn't know what to do with that. Standing there in the February cold with Harker's papers in my hand, and the wind coming off the buttes in long, steady pulls. I said, You have no idea what I've done. She said, I know what you've done since October. That's 4 months. That's more of a man's character than most people get to see. I looked away. Out at the flat, the dead grass under the snow, the tree line to the north where Gray Wolf was in the ground and my uncle before him and my wife and son up on the ridge. I said, there was a time when I was a man who could do something about all of this, could ride out and make the thing he wanted happen by the force of himself. I'm not sure I'm that man anymore. I'm not sure I've been him for years. She said, You're still standing. That's not nothing. A lot of men fall down when everything keeps getting taken. You haven't. I turned back to her. She was looking at me without mercy and without sentiment, which is the only kind of looking that means anything. Not the kind that flatters, not the kind that pities, the kind that sees what's there and says it plain. Her eyes were dark brown, nearly black in the winter light, and they were absolutely steady. She said, "Don't tell me you're not still that man. I know what I see." I said quietly, "And what do you see?" She said, "A man who's been doing the impossible for 11 years and hasn't stopped yet. A man who's buried his wife and his son and his uncle and his advisor and gotten up every morning after and done what his people needed. A man who took in a woman with nothing and asked nothing back for it. A man who sits with papers he won't sign knowing what it's going to cost him, and signs or doesn't sign based on what's right. That's what I see. I've looked at enough men to know how rare it is." I didn't answer. She reached out and put her hand on my arm. Not a grip, not a hold, just the flat of her palm through my coat. Warm, even through the wool. She left it there a moment. She said, "I see you. I want you to know that someone sees you." That was all. She went back inside. I stood there on the frozen flat for a long time with her hand's warmth still on my arm, and the papers loose in my other hand, and the wind doing its long, indifferent work on everything around me. I want to be careful how I tell this next part. Not because it's complicated, but because it isn't, and I don't want to dress it up with things that didn't happen. What happened between Nora Cade and me happened the way things happen when two people have been honest with each other long enough. Not all at once, not with dramatic occasion, but slowly and then permanently, the way ice goes out in spring. One day it's there. A few weeks later you look and it's gone, and you can't point to the exact moment it left because it was so gradual that each day's change was too small to see. In March, she told me she wasn't leaving. We were sitting by the fire late, after the camp had gone to bed. This was a thing we did most nights by that point, no particular arrangement. No one had decided it, just the habit of it. Both of us drawn to the same fire at the same hour as naturally as the horses come to the same trough. She was working on a pair of moccasins for Chask, which Than had started and left for her to finish, because Than's back had been bad and the close work was hard on it. I was working on what I was going to say to Harker when he came back in spring, not writing it down, just turning it over in my head the way you do, looking for the angle that would get the most of what I needed out of the least of what I had to give. She said without preamble, "I'm not leaving when the weather breaks." I said, "Where would you go?" She said I could go somewhere. There are places. I have the horse. I have enough Lakota now that I could find work translating at one of the northern agencies, or there are women in some of the settlements who take in other women. I've thought about it. I know what the options are. I said, "But you're not going." She said, "No." I said, "Why?" She put down the moccasin and looked at me. She said, "You know why." I said, "I want to hear it." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "Because this is the first place I've been where I wasn't afraid. And that's because of you, not just the camp, not just being far from Roy and what he was, not just having Than and the work and people I've come to care about. It's you, because of how you are, how you carry yourself, how you see people and what you do with what you see. And because—" She stopped. I said, "And because—" She said steadily, "And because I'm in love with you. I've been in love with you since December, I think, or maybe before that. I don't know the exact day, the exact moment it settled into being that word rather than something I couldn't name. I just know that when I try to imagine leaving, when I try to picture myself somewhere else with some other life, I can't make myself believe in it. There's no life on the other side of leaving that feels real to me." The fire settled. Outside, the wind was easy, not the hard February wind, the milder March kind that has spring somewhere behind it even if it's still cold. I said, "Nora." She said, "I know it's complicated. I know what it means for your people if you—" I said, "Nora, come here." She came to sit beside me on the same log, close enough that our arms touched. I put my hand over hers. Her hands were cold. She worked in the cold without complaining about it and sometimes forgot to warm them. I wrapped both of mine around one of hers. I said, I have been trying not to think about you since November. She said, how's that been going? I said, not well. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but almost. I said, what happened to you? What your uncle did, I won't pretend I understand it or that I know how to be careful enough around it. I'll get it wrong sometimes. I already have, probably without knowing. She said, so will I. I've gotten things wrong here that I didn't even realize until later. That's not a reason. I said, what I mean is I can't promise to be simple. I have 52 people in Harker coming in the spring and a summer range I'm about to lose and my nephew heading towards something I can't fully see yet and 3 families whose lives rest on the decisions I make. That's my life. It's not going to stop being my life. She said, I know what your life is. I've been inside it since October. I said, I know you have. She said, I'm not asking you to set it down. I'm not asking for some smaller, easier version of you. I'm asking to stand in the thing that's already there, to be a part of it, if you want that. I looked at her. In the firelight, she looked like someone who had been remade by a long difficulty. Not broken and put back together crooked, but recast. There was still a wariness in her that I knew would never fully leave, the body carrying its own kind of memory that the mind doesn't control. The way a horse that was once hurt bad in a certain way will always flinch a little at that particular motion even years later. But underneath it, solid and unmoving, something I recognized. The quality in a person that makes them capable of giving something real. She was looking at me and she was not asking to be saved. She was not asking to be taken care of. She was offering herself freely as a person who had decided what she wanted and was saying so, which was the bravest and the most dignified thing I'd seen in a long time. I said, I don't want to send you away. I haven't wanted to since the morning I watched you break the ice. She said, that was December. I said, yes. She said, you waited a long time. I said, I was being careful. She said, so was I. I opened my hand on top of hers. She turned hers over and held on. We sat like that by the fire for a long time, not talking much, not needing to, the way people sit when the important thing has been said, and what comes after is just the being in the same place without needing to name it every minute. Outside, the wind moved around the lodge and the fire burned down slow, and the camp was quiet, and the night was just the night, ordinary and enormous the way nights are on the plains. The kind of dark that makes the stars look close enough to put your hand to. I should tell you about Harker. He came back in April, when the ground had thawed enough to ride without the horses sinking to their knocks in the soft places, when the first green was coming up in the low spots, and the creek had ice only at the edges in the early morning. He came again with the 2 soldiers, and this time without the lawyer, which I took as a sign that he'd already been told the legal work was done whether I signed or not. He had a look about him that men get when they've resolved themselves to delivering news they know the other person won't want. A kind of settled, apologetic set to his face that wasn't entirely performed. Nora was the one who met him at the edge of camp. I'd told her she didn't have to. She'd said she wanted to. I let her make her own choices. That was the deal between us by then, stated or not. She met Harker at the camp's edge and said in plain English, Mr. Harker, Chief Long Cloud will be with you in a minute. Can I get you water? Harker looked at her for a long moment, taking in the camp around her, the moccasins on her feet, the easy way she stood in a place that was clearly hers. Not a visitor's posture, a woman in her own yard. He said politely, Ma'am, are you here of your own accord? Nora said, I am. This is where I live. He said, I see, and you are. She said, Nora Longcloud. She said it straight, no pause, no checking over her shoulder. Just said it and held his eye and waited. She hadn't talked to me about saying that. She hadn't asked, She just said it. I heard it from 30 feet away, coming out of the lodge. I stopped. I stood there a moment with my hand on the lodge door in the April cold, and something in me that had been held tight for a very long time, not grief exactly, not loneliness exactly, but the particular tension of a man carrying a heavy thing alone, loosened one full turn. I went and shook Harker's hand and we walked to the fire, and he told me what he had. His new proposal was not what I'd been expecting. The boundary was still moving, but there was a surveying dispute among two of the settlement companies that had pushed the opening of the western range back to the following spring at the earliest. In the meantime, he had something to offer. Not a full reservation, he didn't use that word, but a formal government recognition of the winter grounds. This camp, this land, where we were standing right now, where my wife was on the North Ridge and Gray Wolf was in the ground and my uncle before them. 300 acres of formal recognition, my signature on a document the government would have to honor, while the larger argument continued. It was not enough. I want to say that plainly. It was not close to enough. The summer range, the hunting grounds, the creek country to the west, those were irreplaceable, and paper recognition of my winter camp didn't come close to making up for it. Any man who called it a fair exchange was either lying or foolish, and Harker was neither. But I was 43 years old with 52 people and a hard winter just behind us and another one coming, and I was not the young man who could afford to wait for perfect anymore, if I'd ever been. Sometimes what you can get is the first step toward what you need, and you take it, and you keep your eyes clear about what it is and what it isn't. I said, I want one change to the language. He said, what change? I said, where it says who holds this land, it should say the people, not the chief, not me by name, the people. He blinked, he said, that's not standard government. I said, it's the change I want. He looked at the papers, he looked at me. He said, I'll need to take it back and have it reworked. I said, then take it back. Come again when it's right. He left. He came back 3 weeks later with the change made. The language was awkward. Lawyers don't like language that doesn't fit their forms, but it was there. My name subordinate to the name of the people. The land held in the name of the band, not the chief alone. I signed. Nora stood at my shoulder when I did it. Than stood on my other side. Harker shook my hand and rode out, and when the sound of his horses had cleared the flat, Than went inside without a word, which was her way of saying she approved. She'd have found something to say if she didn't. Nora put her hand in mine. I looked out at the land that was formally ours now, at least this piece, at least for now, not enough. A start. I said, it doesn't feel like winning. She said no. But it's something that didn't exist yesterday. That's worth something. I said yes. I held her hand and looked out at the land. What I want to tell you, and I'm coming to the end of this, to the part that happened last, though in another way it's been happening the whole time. What I want to tell you is about a morning in June. By June, Nora and I had been together in the full way since March, openly, with the camp knowing it, and adjusting to it in the way that communities adjust to things that are real. Not easily, not without some friction at the edges, but practically and over time. Than, who had always been my truest mirror, had stopped watching me with that particular concerned attention she'd been giving me for 4 years, and had replaced it with something that might have been satisfaction, though she'd never have called it that. Chask had found a purpose, finally, translation work for an agency to the North run by a man who was actually trying to do the thing right, a man who'd come to it late in life with a genuine interest in getting it less wrong than it had been. Chask spent part of his weeks there now and came back with useful information and a useful kind of tiredness, the tiredness of work that matters, which is different from any other kind. I'll tell you what happened with Chask, because it matters and because Nora was part of it. It was late February, a week after the scene with Harker's papers, when Chask came to me in the evening with that coiled look he'd been wearing all winter and said he'd been offered a horse by one of the settlement men payment for a week's translation work, and the horse was worth more than the week. And did I think the man was honest, or was it a trick of some kind? I thought about it. I said, it might be both. An honest man can also make a deal that favors him. Chask said, but is it worth it, going back there? I said, what does the work feel like? He was quiet. Then he said, like something real, like being used for what I can actually do, not just what I look like. I said, then it's worth it. Take the horse if he offers it again. If he doesn't, you still did something that mattered. He looked at me for a moment. Then he looked past me to where Nora was sitting by the fire, and then back at me. He said, she told me something similar, last week, when I was going to go out and do something stupid about lame Elk's cousin. I said, what did she say? He said, she said anger is real, but it needs something to do or it just eats you. She said you were the same way when you were my age, according to Than. I said, Than should keep her opinions to herself. He almost smiled. He said, she has a lot of opinions about you. I said, I know. He left. He took the work at the Northern Agency, and the horse, and he came back the first time with 4 new words in English he'd never had before, and a kind of steadiness in his face that I hadn't seen there in months. 52 people, 3 lodges, not growing, not yet, but holding, really holding, which was something. That June morning, Nora and I went up to the North Ridge. I went up there sometimes when I needed to. Not often, and never on a set schedule, just when the weight of things required a bigger space than the camp could give me, when I needed the wind and the long view and the particular quiet of that high ground. We sat in the grass a little way from where Wombly Wynn was in the ground, not on her grave, just near. The 2 pines were there, grown close together like they decided years ago to keep each other company, their roots tangled underground in ways you'd never see from the surface. Nora knew who was there. I'd told her early, because I didn't want her to walk up on it uninformed, and also because I'd wanted her to know it was part of me, the way all of the people you've lost are part of you. She'd listened without trying to make it easy or difficult, just let it settle into her understanding of who I was. The plain stretched out to the east, all of it green in June the way it's only green for a few weeks, that particular urgent green that doesn't last, before the summer comes and bleaches it. The grass moved in long rolling passes the way it does when the wind is easy and warm, the whole plain breathing. Below us, the camp was just visible through the morning haze, the smoke from the cook fires rising straight, the horses moving slow in the corral, Than's voice occasionally riding the air up to us when she found something below her standard, which was often. Nora was leaning against my shoulder. Her weight against me had become as natural as the weight of my own coat, something you stop noticing because it's just the shape of things. She said after a while, do you think she would have minded, your wife? I thought about that. The true answer, not the comfortable one. I said, she would have been curious about you first. She was curious about everything and everyone. It was the first thing about her, before anything else. She would have asked you 10 questions before she made up her mind, and half of them would have been things no one else would think to ask. Nora said, and then, when she'd made it up. I said, she made up her mind fast and she made it up well. She didn't waste time on the wrong call and she didn't make the same mistake twice, so she would have decided quickly. Nora said, what would she have decided? I said, I think she would have decided that a woman who ran from what you ran from, who came out the other side of it and learned a new language and made herself useful, and didn't ask for anything she hadn't earned, she would have decided that was a woman worth knowing. I think she'd have liked you. Nora was quiet a moment, then she said, I hope so. I think about her sometimes. I said, I know. She said, does that bother you? I said, no. I put my arm around her and she settled against my side, her head against my jaw, warm in the June sun. Below us, the cook fire smoke rose straight in the still morning air, slow and unhurried, and a hawk was working a thermal above the creek draw to the west, high and patient, riding the air with its wings barely moving. She said, after a time, "Do you know what I thought the first time I saw you, when your nephew brought me in and you were standing at the door?" I said, "Tell me." She said, "I thought, that's a man who's still standing." I'd been around enough men by then, had them in every variety you can imagine, and most of them weren't in the real way. They were upright. They were walking around, talking, giving orders, taking things. But standing, actually standing in themselves, with something solid underneath them, something they hadn't borrowed and hadn't stolen and hadn't gotten by taking it from someone else. I'd stopped expecting to find it. And then there you were. And that's what I thought. That man is still standing. I said I was holding on. She said, holding on is standing. Ask anyone who's done it for any length of time. I looked out at the plain. I said, I don't know how much more of this we save. The hunting range, the way of life. The language, even. I have children in my camp who know fewer of the old words than their parents did. I don't know what's coming or how much of what I love is going to be there at the end of it. She said no. I said, some days that's the whole of what I feel. Just that not knowing and the not knowing having weight to it. She said, I know, but you're still here. The land's still here today. Your people are here, and so am I. She lifted her head and turned to look at me. There are looks that need words behind them and looks that don't. She'd gotten better at this since October, or maybe I'd gotten better at reading her. The way the wariness in her had become a kind of watchfulness instead, the defensive thing turned into the attentive thing, the same basic capacity used for a different purpose. Her eyes on me now were clear and dark and steady, and without any question in them at all. Not asking, giving. The way she'd been giving since February when she'd put her hand on my arm and said, I see you. The way a person gives when they've got something real and they've decided you're worth it. I put my hand to her face. She closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment. Then she opened them and looked at me again. She said quietly, I chose you. I want you to know that, not because I had nowhere else to go. Not because you were convenient or because you were the only one there. Because I looked at you and I saw what was worth seeing and I decided. That's the whole of it. I said, I know. She said, I'm going to keep choosing you. Every morning, that's what I'm telling you. I said, and I you. She put her hand over mine, the one on her face, and held it there. Her hand was warm in the June sun, the calluses on her palm from months of work that was now just her work, ordinary and belonging. Below us, the cook fires sent their smoke straight up into the still blue morning. The hawk had found what it was looking for and gone. The grass moved and moved in the easy wind, the whole long plain breathing the way it always had and maybe always would, and at least for now, and at least for today was still ours. I said her name. She said, I know. She held my hand against her face. We sat like that on the North Ridge in the June morning until Than's voice came up the hill looking for us, and even then we didn't hurry, and below us the camp went on doing the work of itself, the smoke rising, the horses moving, 52 people holding on in the good way, in the way that doesn't feel like losing.